Welcome to Beat Check with the Oregonian. I'm Elliot Noose. As we head into a primary election this month, the Oregonian and OregonLive has published a series of stories based on new polling commissioned by the news organization and conducted by DHM Research. DHM is based in Portland, and its Senior Vice President, John Horvick, is here to walk us through the findings. John, welcome to Beat Check.
Oh, thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Also joining me today are two of the journalists who have reported on the poll results. Mike Rogoway covers technology and economic news for the Oregonian. Welcome back, Mike.
Good morning, Elliot.
And a familiar voice to Beat Check listeners, Portland City Hall reporter and sometime Beat Check host Shane Dixon Kavanaugh is here as well. Welcome, Shane.
Hooray!
So before we get into the poll's big findings, John, let's talk a little bit about how polling works. How exactly do we, or do you and your firm, talk to about 600 people from 3 counties, and then use that to glean some insight into the viewpoints and sentiments of more than I think 1.3 million registered voters throughout the metro area?
So survey research has evolved over the years as technology has changed, as people's preferences for how they want to be contacted has changed. And we've had to evolve with that. So if we think of how surveys were done when I started in the business about 15 years ago or so, everything was live interview telephone calls, and a lot of it was random digit dialing, which means really dialing phone numbers at random. Things have changed since then with the advent of cell phones and caller ID in particular. People were able to screen their phones to answer the calls that they want to answer and not answer the ones that they don't want to answer. And then also phone numbers became portable. And so lots of people in the Portland area have numbers that aren't 503 or 971 area codes. And also there's plenty of people outside the Portland area that have maintained those numbers. And so you can't rely on random digit dialing the way we used to. This survey and most surveys now are based off of listed sample, meaning there's a list of contacts of people, and then you contact those people at random. In Oregon, for polling purposes, we're really fortunate because we have automatic voter registration, and about 94% of those who are eligible to vote are registered to vote. And so so for this survey and a lot of the work that we do, we poll that list of registered voters in this case, the 3-county area on the Oregon side of the river, so Clackamas, Washington, and Multnomah. And those voter file records are matched back to telephone records. And there's different ways to go about doing that, but that's the process. Voter records are great because we know where people live. We know their party registration. We know their age. We know how frequently they vote. Not, of course, how they vote, but in what elections that they vote. So then when we do a survey, we randomly dial on those contacts. Now, the big challenge in the polling world is that response rates have declined over time, which is a problem. But the bigger challenge really is that response rates have declined at different rates. And so we know that, for example, young people take surveys less frequently than people who are older, women more than men, those with a college education more than those with less education. There's other characteristics. And so when we do a survey like this, we're dialing phone numbers at random off the voter list. And also we're setting quotas. So we can say, we know that there's this percentage of people who are 65 and older in the community or who are registered voters, and this many people who say are Democrats. And we make sure that when we're dialing, we get the right number of people in all those categories. The one other big change that's happened is that some people just won't talk to somebody on the phone. They just won't, but they will answer a text message. And so we use both. We continue to call people with the live interview, and they can administer the interview like kind of the traditional way. And then that's about half the sample, and about the other half of the sample gets a text message with a link that they can take the survey on their smartphone, or they can take it on another device if they prefer. So we try to reach people in different ways. We acknowledge that there's different response rates and account for that. And then in this case, we had a sample size of 600 people for the region, which has a margin of error of 4%.
And we also had results for just Multnomah County for some of the closely watched races there.
That's right. So we did oversample Multnomah County a bit. So if we did the 3 counties proportionally, we would have had a sample something less than 300 for Multnomah County. I can't remember what the exact number is, but 275, 250, something about that. We wanted to say, all right, we wanted to ask in particular about the district attorney's race. And so that's a Multnomah County specific race, and we didn't need to ask people in Clackamas County or Washington County about it, but we wanted to have at least 300 in Multnomah. And so we oversample Multnomah County to get to 300. And then when we're looking at just the Multnomah County results, we have a sample size of 300, which has a margin of error of 5.7%. Now, in order to do that, it means that our sort of proportions for the three counties are out of whack now. But when we look at the total results for the 600, we do a little statistical weighting, a little bit of math. And so the Multnomah County, when we're looking at the overall results for the whole region, we squeeze down the impact of the Multnomah County numbers a little bit, and we bump up the impact of Clackamas and Washington County a little bit so that proportionally the areas are represented as they ought to be in the overall results.
So let's get into the poll results. John, obviously you helped shape the survey and your poll conducted it, and Shane and Mike, you have done a lot of the reporting that came out of the polling, not only on the results but also talking to some of the respondents and experts in fields related to what was being asked about. So, Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the interesting findings that you've reported on?
Yeah, well, to go back a few years, the Oregonian hadn't done polling for a little bit in the years prior to the pandemic. And coming out of the pandemic, one of our colleagues, Jamie Goldberg, was writing about downtown. And one of the things at that time, crime rates were fairly low downtown, with the notable exception of the protests around the federal courthouse. But she had the sense that people had very negative perceptions of downtown. And we were trying to sort of reconcile those things. And she talked to a Portland State University professor who said, well, perception is reality. And that's kind of what motivated us to start doing polls again, to look into these issues and see what are people thinking about downtown, what can we expect? And so we asked John and DHM to do some polling. And at that time, we found that people were quite concerned about the situation downtown. But very few people had been downtown at that time. But remember, this was the middle of the pandemic. And as it's worked out, that poll was kind of a leading indicator for where things were going. People didn't come back and have stayed away. And John, you can jump in and correct me or add to it. But, the top level numbers, I would say, for people's perceptions of downtown have been relatively consistent. In this poll, a little more than 3/4 have a negative impression of downtown Portland. And 50% of those say they have a strongly negative impression. The number of people coming downtown, I think 70% of the people who responded to the poll have been downtown in the last month. It's not that they can't see for themselves how things look, but they still have a very negative impression. Despite all the work the city has done, festivals, new patrols, the fentanyl state of emergency for downtown, that people have been concerned. And, when you looked at the top line poll finding, I would say from this poll, what are people's greatest overall concern about the metro area? It's homelessness overall. And I think people continue to associate that with downtown. Now, coming back to that perception and reality question, I work downtown. I'm here 5 days a week. And I kind of wondered, are people really perceiving things right? Has there been any indication of change? And so I added up the Portland police statistics for downtown crime. They publish all this in an open table format that you can access. And I looked at their numbers for downtown, the Pearl District, and Old Town to see what's happened. And what I found was there was, as we all know, there was a big spike in crime in 2021 and 2022. And that conditions actually seemed to get worse in 2023. But then starting last fall, there was a big reversal. And the crime statistics include assaults, they include burglary, they include vandalism. There's a huge decline starting in about September. And now we're actually, the number of offenses the police report downtown are back below 2019 levels. Now, I don't really think we can compare to 2019 because foot traffic downtown is about 40% of what it was, 40% below what it was in 2019. But crime levels are way down over the last several months, and the trend has continued downward. And it suggests to me that some of the city's efforts have been making progress, but then we come back to this perception issue. It's going to take a long time to change what people think of downtown, given what we've been through, with all the upheaval. And it's an open question whether these numbers will stay relatively low. So, those were some of the takeaways I had that jumped out. One other thing we looked at was people's perceptions of the economy. And John, I'm really interested in your feedback on this. I'm not sure that this exact question is the one you usually are asking people, but we asked how people rate their current financial situation. And I was fairly surprised. 3/4 of the people said good or very good. That we hear so much about negativity about the economy, but ask people how they're doing, and most people said they're doing pretty well. John, what'd you make of that?
Yeah, it's consistent with a broader trend where there's a big gap, an historically large gap between how people are rating the economy generally, or the American economy, or say the Oregon economy, and how they're doing personally. And I think there's different reasons for why this gap exists. Some of it, frankly, is just straight up partisanship, where Republicans have been, this is more state and national surveys, but Republicans have just been unwilling to acknowledge improvements in the economy. And partly because maybe they don't see them, partly because they would like different policies and sort of making a judgment that way. And we just don't have that many Republicans in the Portland metro area. We don't have many Republicans in Portland. And so maybe that dynamic isn't quite as present here. If you look at the overall survey results, you could absolutely paint a negative picture. Whether you look at the right direction, wrong track number, where you look at sort of the importance of the issues or the progress that people think we're making on crime and homelessness and drugs. And also the right direction number is not as bad as it was before. 3/4 of people are feeling good financially. And so there is this, I'm wondering what the trend is going to be a year from now or 6 months from now, to Mike's point too about crime. Like, if I squint and look at the data, I could potentially tell a story like maybe we're at an inflection point, because there is that real strong positivity about how people are doing personally. There is this softening on some of the numbers that we have. But yeah, people are feeling pretty good. I mean, and it makes sense in a way. I mean, there's plentiful jobs. Inflation has been waning. Stock market's done well. So, compared to times when we've had unemployment in the region 8, 9, 10%, I imagine people are feeling relatively well compared to sometimes in the past.
And to piggyback a little bit more on this issue of perception, and I think Mike and John have really hit on something here that shows up in this polling data in many different iterations and forms. So one of the stories that I did recently based on this poll was looking at what are the top concerns for Portland area voters. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they remain, and they have been since I've been covering local government for the Oregonian. It's homelessness, it's public safety and crime, and it's drug use. However, here was one of the real fascinating data points that came up in this most recent polling and survey. So you take homelessness. And when voters are asked, how serious of a problem is homelessness in the Portland metro region or in downtown Portland, it's almost universally, this is a huge effing deal. Like, it's 98% of survey respondents are saying, this is a serious problem in the region and in downtown Portland. Ask them what they think of homelessness being a problem in their neighborhood. All of a sudden, that number goes down to about 50%. I mean, that gap is humongous. So in your neighborhood and in your community, only about half of these poll participants are saying that homelessness is a serious problem. And yet the rest of the region, downtown, oh man, almost 100%. John, what do you make of that? I'm just curious.
Well, I think part of what I make of it is a consequence of it. Like I think part of what we discovered, or I've discovered, other people would have realized it beforehand, is that there's some issues that can swamp impressions about a place because they're highly visible. I think that because they make people feel something, and that sense of lack of safety or disorder, chaos, uncleanliness, whether it's trash and litter, so maybe around homeless camps, seeing behavior that they feel is damaging or immoral with drug use, that unlike, say, traffic congestion or school funding or the unemployment rate, these issues are so visual and visceral to people that they can paint a perception beyond what we sort of observe with other types of problems that Portland has, or the region has, dealt with in the past. So when you see a homeless camp downtown, or maybe on the Springwater corridor or something, that I think creates a sense of place that's so expansive, and it's going to be very challenging to get those images and those feelings associated with that sort of out of people's minds. That it's the clawback from where we're at, 2021, 2022, down 2024 is going to, I suspect, can be quite slow. In part because the challenges are hard, but also just emotionally and sort of visually, these are qualitatively different things than sort of other problems that we've talked about in the past, like too much traffic or school buildings being out of date. It's just these are different things. And I'd say the one other thing that's with regards to the most important pressing issues is, on that question, we asked, what's the most important problem facing the region today? And homelessness, 1, crime and drugs, 2 and 3. I always like to pay attention to what's not on the list or sort of far down the list. And the one that I would call out, and I think is particularly notable now, several months removed from the teacher strike in Portland, is that education isn't showing up. And this has been a trend over the last 4 or 5 years, not just here in the region, but statewide, where education used to consistently be a top 1 or 2 issue in the state or the region or the city. And it's just being crowded out. It's just being crowded out by these problems like homelessness and drugs and crime. And so these are not only hard problems on their own, but I think they're making it more difficult for us to solve or address or get attention to other problems as well, because they take a backseat to the big 3.
Well, similar to where education falls on that list of top concerns, another one of those that really was rather low on the list by comparison, that surprised me a little bit, was lack of affordable housing. I mean, and especially because that the housing question is in some ways inextricably linked to our homelessness crisis, and then some of the visible manifestations of public safety, behavioral, and mental health stuff. But still, the big 3 crowd out even affordable housing, which we know, I mean, people can't afford houses right now. We have a severe housing shortage. It is the singular sort of focus of our governor right now. And yet it was only 9%, I believe, in this survey that says lack of affordable housing is the biggest issue.
Shane, to illustrate that point, I mean, just 3% rated the economy is the most serious issue. But then when you asked people, if they approve of how the government's managing the economy or managing schools, for example, it was still overwhelmingly negative. 2/3 were negative. On the other hand, they were relatively good compared to other issues that were rated on. In fact, those of the close to a dozen issues I think you asked about, those were the best performing ones, even though they were strongly negative. It probably all speaks to the crowding out point that you were making, that people aren't necessarily thrilled with how things are going. But boy, schools look relatively good when so many other things are going so much worse.
Let's talk a little more about the perceptions of public officials. Shane, this is something that you did some reporting on.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe as a as a headline, once again, it's not going to be a total shock to listeners or readers of the Oregonian OregonLive coverage, but just that Portland area voters hold dismal, and I think in my headline I said abysmal views or worse of every top elected official in the metro area, from county commission chairs to Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler and the Portland City Council. So it really was, I think what stood out here was just the sky high disapproval ratings of some of these elected officials or government bodies, where we're looking at a 70% disapproval rating among Portland voters in their attitudes toward Portland City Hall and city government. And yet, the three leading candidates to become the next mayor of Portland are all sitting city commissioners. Okay. Mayor, the city council is even less popular than Mayor Ted Wheeler right now. And his numbers for years have been in the tank. And while only 24% of city resident voters that we polled said they approve of the job that Wheeler's doing, I can tell you that is significantly higher than it was than even a year or two ago. But and obviously, Portland has had its struggles. We've been a national punching bag, have been in the news. But, we've also had a number of stories, and there, the narrative is a little more mixed in the metro area, where Washington County and Clackamas County, their leaders, Clackamas County in particular, constantly using Portland to sort of prove the point that Clackamas County's doing things way better, that we've got it all figured out, that we're making real, credible progress on homelessness, and we don't have out of control, crazy crime. And yet, you look at, we looked at this sort of standing of Clackamas County Chair Tootie Smith, who's running for re-election right now. And guess what? She has a net disapproval rating. More voters disapprove of the job that Tootie Smith is doing than voters who approve of her job. Similar in Washington County as well, where, our colleague Nicole Hayden had this remarkable piece just a few weeks ago talking about how Washington County has credibly claimed that they have essentially eliminated unsanctioned homeless camps in the county. That's remarkable, especially when you look at what's going on in Portland still. And yet, is their county chair getting high marks for the work that they're doing right now? Absolutely not. And similarly, it's not just sort of the kind of abysmal ratings of almost every elected official that we asked about by name, but also asking voters, how is city or county government doing on addressing a whole range of issues? And I was a little shocked. John, maybe you can weigh in on this, and Mike as well. But voters were saying on a 5-1 margin that city and counties were doing a terrible job on homelessness, on drug use, and on housing issues. And it was basically 2/3, so not quite a 5-1 margin, but pretty darn close. When we're talking about crime or even road conditions or, local government's job of dealing with sanitation, trash, and litter. It's just across the board. It's government's doing a terrible job. These are the people that we as as voters and residents in these communities have recently elected to put into office, right? These were the folks that have been elected within the last 4 years or 2 years that are supposed to be we've chosen them to meaningfully tackle these issues. And the perception right now is that nobody's getting the job done.
John, how hard is it to shake that perception that, no question that a lot of these public officials have had these offices in a pretty difficult time. Are they are they saddled with the fallout with that for the whatever's left of all of their political careers?
Less of future is long. All their political careers. I don't know. I don't know about that. I would say that most folks don't pay close attention to local government. They just don't. And so some are going to have an impression of these elected leaders, then their impression is going to be based upon the conditions that they're experiencing in their day-to-day lives. It may be related to the actual leadership of the officer or not. And you can't totally take away just the larger environment that these elected officials are trying to govern in, and whether that's the decline of institutions generally. We've seen whether it's the United States Congress or the police or colleges and universities or the church, right? There's just been this erosion of confidence in institutions that's been going on for a while, and that affects these elected leaders. And then frankly, I've done so many focus groups where we ask people about an elected leader or a body of government and, trying to get their impression that they think that they're doing a good job or not. And our participants in the focus group will list off all sorts of problems. Many or none of them may have to be the purview of the elected leader themselves. And like at the classic example, we didn't ask in this survey, we've asked in other surveys in the Portland metro region, who's more responsible for, or who do you hold more accountable, or who do you hold more responsible for addressing homelessness? And overwhelmingly, people will say the city of Portland, not the county.
I knew you're going to raise that one, John. that one's
so part of it is these elected officials are getting blamed for problems in their community. They're getting blamed. They're getting caught up in the wave of sort of institutional decline. And then folks are just like, darn it, you're a leader. Fix my problems. And they might not know who's actually responsible for fixing the problems, but they are looking towards their elected officials to fix them regardless.
We haven't talked yet about the district attorney's race, or at least not except in very brief. We don't have a reporter here who reported on that. But we did poll on that, and our colleague Noelle Crombie wrote a story about it. This question was interesting because it was asked in two ways. One, sort of just by name, who would you vote for?
Yep.
Who would you vote for, Mike Schmidt or Nathan Vasquez? And asked that way, 22% of voters said they would vote for Schmidt, and 34% said they would vote for Vasquez. And 44% were undecided. Then the person taking the poll on the phone provided a little bit of information, the kind of thing that you might find in a voter's pamphlet. John, can you speak to the sort of information that they might have heard? Sure.
So when we did the survey, we expected, I think it was then confirmed in the results, that despite the fact that this race is getting a lot of attention relative to other campaigns that are happening right now in the region, certainly getting a lot more attention relative to DA races have gotten in the past, still most voters don't pay a lot of attention to district attorney elections. So we thought, gosh, that don't know or undecided number might be pretty high. They might not know who these people are, why they would vote for them one way or the other. And we, like you said, like the leading candidate in our first head-to-head test was undecided or don't know. And then, so we did ask a follow-up question to try to give people a sense of sort of the sort of perspective that they have, or the sort of the side of the issue that they're coming from. And so we told people that Mike Schmidt is the elected DA, so he's the incumbent. So people had that context, right? That they knew that he's the person who's been in charge for the last 4 years. And also that he's been endorsed by Democratic office holders and progressive organizations. So people could get a sense of he's the guy in charge. This is sort of the constellation of supporters that he has. And for Nathan Vasquez, we let folks know that he's been a prosecutor in the office for years and years, decades. And that he's supported by so business community and fire and police unions to try to give people a sense. And then once we give people a little bit of sense of information, that undecided drops from mid 40s to 20%, I think. And so people were able to sort of sort themselves a little bit, but that lead for Vasquez maintained. All that said, we did the survey before people got their ballots. And lots of folks said that they didn't know who they're going to vote for. And earlier in the survey, we asked people just if they had a positive or approved or disapproved of Mike Schmidt's job performance, and a good chunk of people weren't able to give an answer. So I think it's clear that Nathan Vasquez sort of enters the prime of the election cycle as people are getting their ballots with the lead, and that Mike Schmidt's very vulnerable. And also, lots of folks haven't made their mind up and maybe could be persuaded one way or the other.
And if I may offer a few additional observations based on what we saw in the polling and then sort of what we're seeing subsequently. When I saw those poll numbers and saw Noelle's story after that she wrote based on those poll results, I think my initial thought was, oh my, Mike Schmidt, dead man walking. But a few things have already, just within a few days, there are a few things where my perception on that assessment has shifted somewhat dramatically. To John's point, the high level of undecideds, I don't know who either of these two guys are, is a huge benefit for potentially the incumbent, because there is still an opportunity here to define your candidacy, or more importantly, define your opponent. So there is a huge persuadable swath of the electorate. And so who's going to make the more convincing pitch in terms of, ads, commercials, mailers, and things like that? Similarly, Nathan Vasquez throughout this race has been vastly outraising Schmidt in terms of just money and dollars. But within the last couple of days, we've seen a huge flood of money come into Mike Schmidt's coffers that is putting him on par, on par with Vasquez, or much more competitive. So he's going to be able to get his sort of message out there as well. And one thing that we've seen in this race, both in terms of the ads and just the messaging in general, is that Mike Schmidt is hammering on the fact that he's a Democrat. He's supported by Democrats, and raising attention to the fact that Nathan Vasquez had been a lifelong Republican until relatively recently, 2017, during the Trump administration. Vasquez went from Republican to non-affiliated, but his campaign is just hammering Vasquez and trying to brand him with that bright red R. And I want to tie this into what we saw a couple of years ago with what we saw in polling data and what the final election results were. John, you'll remember this. When we polled on Joanne Hardesty versus Renee Gonzalez, sort of a similar dynamic too, which is we saw polling numbers where Hardesty was in deep trouble, a deeply unpopular incumbent, fairly high name recognition, and Gonzalez was just leading her by leaps and bounds. However, she and her campaign had a similar constellation of supporters, and they really leaned into her progressive bona fides, and sort of Democratic endorsements, and really tried to make the argument that Renee Gonzalez was actually right wing or a closet Republican. And even though she was vastly outspent in that race because there was a bunch of money from outside groups coming in, when we saw the final results, it wasn't a total rout. It was 53-47. Hardesty came far closer to winning re-election than I think anybody assumed or expected. And so I'm sort of seeing those similar dynamics in this race. With a very similar kind of message toward the outsider opponent. And so I don't know. I think that really describes the dynamic of the campaign we're seeing right now. I mean, you see the flyers and sort of the messaging that Mike Schmidt has, and Mike Schmidt's whole campaign at this point is to define Nathan Vasquez as unacceptable to this community, whether that is his former Republicanism, whether it's the fact that he's supported by, big business or Betsy Johnson or whatever it might be, but to define him as unacceptable. And Nathan Vasquez has got a different task. His task is to make this a referendum on the incumbent. If you knew nothing about this race, if you knew nothing about the last 4 years, and you were just given a list of supporters, endorsers for the two candidates, and know that it's Multnomah County,
it's a runaway for Mike Schmidt. His groups, his long list of Democratic legislators, his long list of progressive organizations, lined up against some big corporate types for Nathan Vasquez and police and fire unions. That dynamic is very favorable to Mike Schmidt, but Mike Schmidt also has 4 years of being DA at a time when people are very upset. But I think Shane really sort of describes it well. Like the Mike Schmidt is going to use these last couple of weeks to really try to define Nathan Vasquez as an unacceptable for the community.
And he now has the money to do it in a way that even a couple of weeks ago, it did not look like he did.
There's a lot of really interesting stuff covered in this poll. John, is there anything else before we wrap things up here that drew your attention that we haven't already talked about?
Oh, sure. One of the biggest public policy issues that Portland's been having for the last several years is how to address unsanctioned camping. And in this survey, we asked whether or not, kind of gave people two choices. And I understand that the world's more complicated than these two choices, but one choice was local government should be able to ban camping and arrest and fine those who don't move public space. And the other position was so long as there's not enough public space, enough shelters, people should have the right to camp in public spaces. And it's not particularly close. Let me pull up my numbers so I don't say it wrong. But it's 63% local government should be able to ban, fine, or arrest anybody who refuses to leave public spaces. 27% saying that people have a right to camp if there's not enough shelters. There are legal issues. There are moral issues with this, but this is not a question where the community is particularly divided about. They land pretty squarely on we should be able to move people. And maybe that's the wrong policy, and maybe that's immoral, and people can make those own judgments, but it's pretty clear where the community's at this point.
You mentioned the moral and legal issues, John, and in addition, the Supreme Court is deciding right now what the Constitution requires communities to allow. Oregon had to pass its own law, I think, in 2021 that restricts removal of camps. The poll results suggested to me that law could be in trouble if somebody decided to challenge it at the ballot box.
I think very difficult to do it legislatively because I don't think Democratic legislators, I think they're on the other side of that. They're in the 27% on that. But yeah, if there were a ballot measure, and keep in mind, this is the Portland metro region where this question is being asked. I can only imagine that the numbers are more lopsided if we get outside the Portland metro region.
Yeah, even more lopsided. And I think we saw with Measure 110, absent the possibility of a referendum on that, who knows if the legislature would have done something, but they moved fairly quickly to do something under that threat. I would say that law might be tenuous. I would be very surprised, and Shane, you could inform us on that, but I would be very surprised if some of the moneyed interest in Oregon politics aren't looking at that number with some interest.
You mentioned Measure 110, Mike, and there was another question on there that was interesting. The question about addiction. 49% of survey respondents said that hard drug use should be treated like a crime, while 45% said it should be treated as a public health problem. So it seems certainly a dramatic, seemingly a dramatic shift from when Measure 110 passed by a wide margin, but still showing some ambivalence there on how exactly to confront this issue.
Yeah, that's interesting that there is that division is there, and there aren't huge demographic differences when you look at the outcome of that, by gender or age or things of that nature. But where we do see a big difference is that those who say it should be treated like a crime are back in Vasquez here in Multnomah County, and those who say that it should be treated like a health problem are more solidly behind Schmidt. So that sort of policy belief or that sort of notion where you land on that is really shaping how you think about the DA's race.
We are running short on time here, but John, while you're here, I wanted to really quickly look ahead to the Portland City Council races coming up in November. It's going to be the first time, and please correct me if I get any of the details here wrong, but it's going to be the first time that Portlanders elect 12 city councilors as well as a mayor. instead of choosing a single candidate, voters are going to rank the candidates in order of preference. Voters for losing candidates will get instantly reapportioned to the next top-ranked candidate, and districts will elect multiple representatives at the same time. So several people on the same ballot question ultimately will be seated. So, John, as a pollster, does this just have you like waking up in a cold sweat, or what?
It's going to be very, very challenging to poll, and I suspect that we'll see. I expect we won't see much polling on the individual races, and what we do see will have to be far from perfect. And let me just give you an example. So historically in Portland, if you want to poll, let's say in the city council race, it's a citywide race. It's first past the post. You just ask, do you like Joe or Jill? And you get a number. So now we have 4 districts. And so you need sufficient sample sizes in each district to say anything about that district. So that's just makes things more expensive and more challenging to do. And then in District 2, for example, right now, which is Northeast Portland, I don't have the list in front of me, but there's more than 20 candidates who right now. And so if I'm on the phone with somebody, to read all 20 names, ask them for their first choice and their second choice and their third choice and their fourth choice and their fifth choice and sixth, the survey gets so long that I think there's that combination of, needing to do 4 surveys rather than 1. If you want good numbers, to ask about all the candidates and then have people rank them, it's going to be really difficult to administer. And I don't think that there's not a good polling solution. I mean, it's going to be expensive, or you're going to make trade-offs, like maybe you don't read all the names, or maybe you only ask people for first choice. You can do some things like that, but we won't be able, polling wise, realistically, to mirror what people are going to do on the ballot. So that'll be a change for people who sort of expect lots of polling around these city council or mayoral races. It'll definitely be more challenging in the future, and we might see less of it because of the cost and the implementation burdens would be my guess. I'd love to do some. Love to go give it a try, but there are some real challenges.
And what about the electoral dynamic? And as a candidate standing out, or as a voter, trying to work your way through those 20 candidates?
Yeah, I think we're figuring out how candidates are going to do that. I think that they're trying to figure out too. There's the advocates for this. I think one of the arguments that they made, well, I know one of the arguments that they made was that this is going to lead to more moderate candidates, because maybe you want to be the second choice. And so you want to be kind to the voters who maybe are preferring somebody else. And so maybe it encourages collaboration. And perhaps, candidates running the slates. Also, again, just take the second district, which with so many candidates, it may encourage folks to be more extreme, to get noticed, to get attention. And you only need to get 25% of the vote of those sort of first place choices after all the ranking is done to win. So I think I don't know. We should have a lot of humility about any expectations about how the new election system in the short term and then in the long term is going to affect how candidates run and how they serve in office. I think there is a case that it's going to lead to more moderate candidates and more friendly competition in the election. I think there's also a case to make that with so many candidates, in order to get attention, you may have to stake out more extreme positions. And because you can win with a minority vote, maybe you're incentivized to do that as well. I don't think we know. I think we'll simply have to watch and observe and learn over the next several months. And we should also assume that this first go around, that there'll be lessons learned and then change of tack in the next elections down the line.
Great. Well, I think we're going to wrap things up there. Our panel today has been John Horvick of DHM Research and Shane Dixon Kavanaugh and Mike Rogoway, reporters for the Oregonian and OregonLive. Thank you all for coming on the show.
Thanks, Elliot.
And thanks for our listeners for making Beat Check with the Oregonian part of your day. If you like the show, give us a 5-star rating review in Apple Podcasts. It helps people find the show. And another way to help is to tell a friend. The best way to support our journalism is with a subscription to OregonLive. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.